Welcome back. With nearly 2 million people incarcerated in the United States is actually the world's largest jailer. Nearly a quarter of a million youth are tried, sentenced, or imprisoned as adults every year across the U.S., and over 10,000 youth are detained or incarcerated in adult jails as prisons. Putting a human face to the sobering statistics, the novel Boy with a Knife is a devastatingly detailed indictment of a criminal justice system that routinely sends youth to adult prisons and jails. Well, the narrative takes us step by step through the main character's crime, trial, and punishment, as well as their survival through prison, as well as his readjustment into regular society. The Boy with a Knife is also a searing critique of the practice of sentencing youth to adult prisons, providing a much-needed wake-up call on how we can change the laws in this country that allow children to be sentenced as adults. Joining us now to share her point of view on this matter, I'm joined by the author of Boy with a Knife and also prison activist, Jean Trounstine. And we thank you so much, Jean, for being with us.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Good to have you. And as we talk about social justice and this particular issue, we look at young people and the incarceration of young people. And I know that you spent a lot of time in the criminal justice system, working in the criminal justice system. Give us your assessment of how you see things right now, particularly when it comes to incarceration and youth incarceration.
First of all, I want to say that it's appalling how many people are in prison, particularly during COVID. And I think one of the things we think about, we think about how many people are in prison in this country, but what a lot of people don't think about, and I know this is true in my state, Massachusetts, and I think it's true across the country, we have 5 times the rate of COVID in prisons and in jails as we do in our state. And we have a pretty low rate in our state, under 1%. And we have 5%. So that's 5 times as many. And I think across the country, in many states, it's worse. In New York, there are some raging cases in different facilities. So right now, we have 2 pandemics. We have the pandemic of incarceration, and we have the pandemic of COVID. Pandemic of incarceration really affects mostly Black and brown people. We have incarcerated our way into an incredibly racist system. Not that we don't have a racist society, but in terms of what you're thinking about, we have to look at how we got here as well as how we get out of here.
When we talk about incarceration, obviously a lot of problems that we have in society, but let's be honest, you cannot incarcerate your way out of some of these problems that we're having. And I think so many times that this is the method that's being used, and we know that it's racist. We know that it's biased. We know that it's prejudice. Talk to me about your work, because you really confront this head on.
Well, first of all, I taught at a women's prison for 10 years, which is how I became an activist. And then I got a letter from someone who was a young man who killed someone when he was 16. This was a long time after I actually stopped working in prison. And he had been incarcerated when he was 16, first offense. It was really a shocking thing to me to see through him what happens to kids. And that's how I began to see that we send in states, every state across the country. In Massachusetts, it's as low as 14. In some states, it's as low as 12. Kids who automatically, we send them to an adult prison if they are convicted of murder. And if they're charged for murder, they get tried and therefore most often sentenced as an adult. So the epidemic, we talk about epidemic, what's happening to our youth is unconscionable. And again, I say how I got involved with this was through a young man who wrote me a letter, but then I got involved by meeting lots of other people, by researching, by finding out what's going on here. That's what happened to me.
Yeah. And then you write the book, Boy with a Knife. And it really is a telling book. Talk to us about Boy with a Knife and the response it's gotten.
It was interesting. It got great response across the country from activists. I had some very tough times with people who who were victims of crime, who accused me of glorifying the perpetrator of a crime, which of course I didn't do. I just wanted to show the other side of the story, how so many kids get into crime. They have stories, they get into things because things have happened to them, and that they need a second chance too. But there are a lot of people who, and it's interesting, the people who are victims of crime are often treated really horribly by our justice system. They don't get anything but the need to, they're used to identify the person who killed or harmed their loved one, and then they're discarded. They don't get therapy. And so when Boy with a Knife came out, there were protests against the book, which of course actually made the book sell more because that's how publicity works. Um, but I'd say one of the most positive things is the people who were in the community of New Bedford and Dartmouth where the crime took place. Many people contacted me and thanked me for writing the real story of the crime.
Mhm. When we talk about this crime, walk us through what happened and give us a little bit for somebody who may not be so familiar with the book.
Thank you. So Carter, I'm a professor. So when I read a story, this is what happened. I just get this letter, someone who had killed someone in a classroom. And Carter hadn't been prepared to kill anybody. He'd gone into the classroom with his buddies. They were trying to rectify a fight, as teenagers often do. And stupidly, they actually went into a classroom. And this was in 1993, before we had the kinds of security systems we have in schools. So they could walk into a classroom, and Carter ended up stabbing a boy who was involved with the crime, but who had actually not been the person that they wanted to get back at. So it was a crime in a classroom, a stabbing in a classroom. It shocked Dartmouth. It was immediately, Carter is a white boy, and so he came from a poor neighborhood. So the narrative became, poor white kid comes into our rich white neighborhood and commits crime. And that, there was that story, which of course had to be debunked. But it was really a shock for what was called a quote unquote sleepy community to have a crime committed there. And I think it's important to tell the stories of kids who you don't think are the typical perpetrators of a murder. And many people have asked me, why I chose Carter. I didn't choose Carter. He chose me because he wrote me a letter.
Amazing. And we talk about this youth incarceration. How many kids across America are actually spending time in adult prisons? And somebody says, and let's be honest, there is this perspective that, that people will take of a false narrative that it's not about necessarily the incarceration in as much as where the incarceration takes place, meaning that we're not saying that a person should not be incarcerated, but we are saying where they're incarcerated makes a difference. And so when you have these young people that are put in adult prisons, talk to us about what you're hearing about that experience and what life is like there. We're not saying that they shouldn't be in prison. Right. It's where they're being incarcerated that's really a challenge.
No, that's really important. I think that punishment for there's lots of different ways we can exact, well, I don't know, reckoning. I'd like to call it reckoning. That's a good word that Danielle Sered uses in her book, as opposed to punishment. Lots of ways to exact reckoning for crime. And, we don't even involve the people who are victims in deciding how they want reckoning. And most of them do not want someone to go to prison for billions of years. They don't want someone to be killed. They want some kind of real thing, which is not an adult prison, because in an adult prison, what happens is you don't get education. So you take a kid who's in the middle of school, you get some sort of maybe education, but it's not guaranteed. You don't get regular health care. You don't get regular psychology, therapy. You don't get the kinds of things that kids need to blossom and to grow. And plus, you put them at risk when you put young people with older people who it's not just risk of rape, but it's risk of a kind of world that they're not involved in. And you sort of force them to grow up in a way that they should not have to grow up. So that's part of it. I mean, an adult prison is a much more horrifying place for someone to be.
Yeah. And I also want to take this time to talk a little bit about life without parole, right? Because that's a very important initiative that you're also connected to. And talk to us about life without parole. A lot of people are incarcerated. We know the death penalty is one of the things that a lot of people look for when there's these crimes that are being committed. But then also an alternative, and some people say it's a healthy alternative. That's debatable. But life without parole.
One of the things that people do not understand is that life without parole is the other death penalty. And when I say it's the death penalty, is many of the people who are sentenced to life without parole die in prison. It's just a slower death. It's not a way of helping them get back to the community. It's not a way of giving them an opportunity to be a citizen. It's not, it's another purely punitive device to really take the responsibility away from, say, we're going to kill them, to killing them in another way. But that's what happens if you sentence somebody to life in prison. You sentence them to die in prison. So most people like me who are working on a lot of these issues are very much against that harsh punishment as a way of, again, dealing with harm that is created. There's lots of other ways to deal with harm. And those are the kind of things we need to explore, how to do this in a more humane way, like other countries do, not the United States. You know, there uh, countries let people stay in prison for 10, 12, maybe 15 years for the worst possible crimes. But we're not like that.
Yeah. So are you saying that maybe there should be a release? Is
I
that
think
is that
I think people should be eligible for parole. I think that there should be, doesn't mean you get out. I mean, let's take somebody, Charlie Manson, or somebody who everybody sort of thinks, who wants that guy out? I mean, I'm not going to judge what he's done. I'm not on the parole board. But if you think somebody has not really changed when they're behind bars, or doesn't would make us unsafe on our streets, there's a stopgap. There's a parole board. There's a way of saying, no, you haven't done enough. But to not be eligible to at least change your life and get on a path where you could be a contributing member of our society seems to me a mistake, because then we're saying people don't deserve to at least try. We're not guaranteeing them the chance, but we're saying they deserve the chance.
that's a huge step to take. I mean, when you think about some of the people who commit some of the most heinous crimes I do see
Yeah.
around the world, but I think to a victim's family, what do you say to those people? Because you got a victim's family there, and here it is. My loved one's been murdered, and if
Right.
my loved one's been murdered, I don't have an opportunity to bring that loved one back, and
Right.
so I don't feel as though sometimes a second chance is warranted. What do you say to those?
Well, okay. So the first thing I say is, what is it that that person really wants the person back, right? So that's what the person wants. You cannot get the loved one back. Then what happens? Then what do you want? Well, most of them want apologies in some way. They want someone to be sorry. They want that person to really do something that shows they will never do anything this horrible again. They want that person not to harm someone. This is from research that I'm citing. Um, Vengeance is the first step. I understand vengeance. I think and maybe you would feel, if somebody harms somebody that I loved, the first thought would be, I want them hurt. But the thought isn't an action. So we have to work through these things to get to what is it that really is going to be better for our society, not just personally satisfying, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth.
Yeah. So give me, where do you see things happening right now as far as criminal justice reform? I know that you're pretty much an advocate for a lot of criminal justice reform, particularly when it comes to the area of young people. You're coming to us out of Massachusetts, working out of Massachusetts. I spent some time in New York working with women at the Bedford Hills Correctional Facility, the only state maximum federal facility. And I remember there was a point when we saw women who were actually serving life sentences actually become eligible for release because of a change in the laws in terms of how we deal with drugs and the three strikes you're out rule.
Right.
What do you see possibly on the horizon for young people? Do you see this massive change nationally when we talk about incarceration? I know it's a state by state case, but can we actually see possibly a change nationally of seeing young people never end up in adult prisons?
I think there's a movement in that direction. I think there's also a movement to close many youth facilities that are not doing a good job. There's, the movement really across the country. What people like me want is for the majority of people to be kept close to home and serve their time in some way where they're close to home and can be with their families. It doesn't serve a kid, it doesn't serve him ultimately in the long run to be away from his family. So if there's a way for him to have this, whatever the punishment is that we need to exact, if there's a way to do it closer to home, and I'm not even sure it has to be punishment, it could be service, it could be, lots of things to help him become more aware of what he has done or she has done. So I think there's a movement, and I think coronavirus has helped this actually, unfortunately, but I think there's a movement to say we've got to do something to help these kids not be set up in situations where they're going to get worse, where they're not going to get better. And ultimately, I think that is better for the person who has the crime committed against them too.
Gene Trounstine, thank you so much for sharing with us. Before we leave, though, I want to get our viewers an opportunity to get connected with your book, Boy with a Knife, and then also to be connected to some of the advocacy and work that you're doing. Even though you're in Boston, listen, nationwide, there's a movement.
Well, you can contact me. I'm on Twitter, Justice with Gene, at Justice with Gene. I have a website, genetrounstine.com. You can find my book. And, I'm very involved in trying to, I guess we might say, as you are, it seems, make this world a better place. And we got to do it one step at a time. And I welcome anybody who wants to contact me.
Yeah, we're all trying to make the world a better. Well, I'll say I am trying to make the world a better place. I don't know if everybody's trying to make the world a better place. And if I look at the current state of affairs, I probably can't say that everybody's trying to make the world a better place. But I do know that you are. Thank you for the work that you're doing in advocating for young people. I think that it's very important that youth do have an opportunity. Not saying that we're not trying to get you out of jail, but we're trying to tell you where you go to jail. That's the most important thing.
Well, and ultimately get out, but
Right.
in a humane way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's a conversation. Gene Trounstine, thank you so much.
Thank you.
All righty, guess what? You've got the information where you can get connected to her if you want to find out more about Boy with the Knife, and if you want to find out more about her work, Gene Trounstine. All right, stay with us. We've got more on the social justice forums. Come right back right after this.